October 1914. The cold waters of Scapa Flow, a vast natural harbor in the Orkney Islands, held the most powerful naval force ever assembled. 40 dreadnought battleships of Britain's Grand Fleet lay at anchor, their massive guns silent, their steel hulls vulnerable. These vessels represented not just Britain's naval supremacy, but the very survival of the nation. Control the seas, control the war. Lose the fleet, lose everything. And on the morning of October 17th, that nightmare nearly became reality. A German submarine, U-18, had penetrated the harbor's defenses. The unthinkable had happened. The Grand Fleet, pride of the Royal Navy, sat exposed in its own anchorage like sheep in a pen, waiting for the wolf. Admiral Sir John Jellicoe, commander of the Grand Fleet, stood on the bridge of his flagship Iron Duke, staring at the gray waters with a knot of dread in his stomach. If the Germans could get one submarine in, they could get 20. A coordinated attack could send half the British battle line to the bottom in a single morning. Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, would later write that Jellicoe was the only man on either side who could lose the war in an afternoon. That afternoon was approaching faster than anyone dared admit. Scapa Flow should have been perfect. This sprawling body of water, nearly 10 miles across, offered sheltered anchorage protected by a ring of islands. Mainland to the south, Hoy to the west, South Ronaldsay to the east. Natural channels between these islands provided access to the open sea, but those same channels now represented fatal vulnerabilities. 7 major entrances, some over 100 feet deep, allowed submarines to slip through under cover of darkness or beneath the waves where no patrol boat could spot them. The Admiralty had assumed the strong tidal currents, treacherous rocks, and remote location would deter German U-boats. They were catastrophically wrong. U-18's infiltration proved that German submarine commanders possessed both the skill and the audacity to strike at the heart of British naval power. Jellicoe faced an impossible choice: abandon Scapa Flow and scatter his fleet to less suitable anchorages around Scotland and Ireland, fragmenting his fighting force, or remain in place and risk annihilation. Either option could hand Germany control of the North Sea. The man tasked with solving this crisis was Commodore Frederick Brock, a naval engineer with a reputation for unorthodox thinking. Brock arrived in Orkney on October 20th, 3 days after the U-18 incident, carrying orders that were as vague as they were urgent. Make Scapa Flow secure, use whatever means necessary, and do it before the Germans struck again. He had no specialized equipment, no trained diving crews, no detailed surveys of the harbor floor. What he did have was authorization to requisition civilian resources, and a mind that saw possibilities where others saw only problems. Standing on the windswept pier at Kirkwall, Orkney's main town, Brock studied the charts with growing conviction. The channels couldn't be permanently closed without trapping the Grand Fleet inside, and they were too deep and too wide for conventional anti-submarine nets. But they could be narrowed, they could be complicated, they could be turned into death traps for any submarine captain bold enough to attempt passage. The solution came to him with sudden clarity: block ships. Deliberately sunk vessels positioned to create underwater obstacles, forcing submarines to navigate narrow, shallow passages where they could be detected and destroyed. The concept was simple. The execution would be anything but. Brock needed ships, dozens of them, and he needed them immediately. The Admiralty authorized him to purchase any obsolete merchant vessels available for scrap. Within a week, a bizarre armada began assembling in Scottish ports. Ancient cargo steamers, worn-out colliers, decommissioned fishing trawlers, even a few Victorian-era paddle steamers that looked like they belonged in a maritime museum. These vessels, destined for the breaker's yard, would instead become the foundation of Scapa Flow's defense. But buying the ships was the easy part. Someone had to sail them to Orkney, position them with precision in channels swept by vicious currents, then sink them in exactly the right spots to create effective barriers. This required seamanship of the highest order, combined with a willingness to deliberately destroy one's own vessel, an act that went against every instinct of a career sailor. Enter Captain James Mackenzie, a 58-year-old merchant skipper from Aberdeen who had spent 40 years at sea and was facing retirement. Mackenzie had commanded cargo vessels on routes from Liverpool to Bombay, weathering typhoons in the Indian Ocean and ice storms in the North Atlantic. He knew ships the way a surgeon knows anatomy, understanding how they moved, how they settled, how they died. When Brock's recruiters approached him in a dockside pub, explaining the mission, Mackenzie's response was immediate. "When do we start?" Within days, he had assembled a crew of fellow merchant captains, engineers, and deckhands, men too old for combat service, but possessing skills the Royal Navy desperately needed. These weren't naval personnel bound by military discipline. They were civilians, volunteers motivated by patriotism and the promise of hazard pay that would secure their families' futures. Mackenzie became the unofficial leader of what the sailors began calling the Blockship Brigade. The first vessel selected for sinking was the Thames, a 3,000-ton collier that had spent 20 years hauling coal from Newcastle to London. On November 3, 1914, Mackenzie stood on her bridge as a skeleton crew prepared to take her to sea one last time. The plan was to position Thames in Hoxa Sound, one of the southern entrances to Scapa Flow. The channel was 400 yards wide and 60 feet deep at its narrowest point. Thames would need to be sunk precisely in the center, her hull settling onto the rocky bottom in a way that created maximum obstruction while leaving enough clearance for surface vessels to pass. There were no precedents for this kind of operation, no manuals to consult. Mackenzie and his team were inventing the procedure as they went. The greatest challenge was timing. Once they opened the sea cocks to flood the ship, they would have perhaps 20 minutes before she went down. In that window, they had to ensure she was positioned correctly, accounting for tide, wind, and current. Get it wrong, and Thames would settle uselessly to one side, leaving the channel open. Or worse, she might block the passage entirely, trapping the Grand Fleet. November 4th dawned cold and gray, with a stiff wind blowing from the northwest. Mackenzie brought Thames through the channel at dead slow speed, feeling his way by landmarks on shore and soundings taken continuously by a leadsman in the bow. 2 Royal Navy patrol boats flanked him, ready to evacuate his crew once the scuttling began. At precisely 10:47 a.m., with Thames positioned as perfectly as human skill could manage, Mackenzie gave the order. Down in the engine room, engineers opened the sea cocks and smashed inlet valves with sledgehammers. Cold seawater rushed into the hull with a sound like thunder. The ship shuddered, listing slightly to port. Mackenzie stood on the bridge, watching the water rise, calculating. Too fast and she might roll over. Too slow and the current would push her off position. The crew scrambled up to the deck as the engine room flooded, then climbed into boats lowered by the patrol vessels. Mackenzie was the last man off, stepping onto a rescue boat when Thames' deck was already awash. 15 minutes later, she slipped beneath the surface with a great surge of bubbles and displaced water, her masts disappearing last. When the water settled, only a slight disturbance on the surface marked where she lay. But beneath the waves, her hull now formed a massive obstacle, reducing the navigable channel to a narrow passage on either side. One down. 69 to go. Over the following weeks, the operation expanded into a massive undertaking that consumed every available resource in Orkney. The Admiralty purchased additional vessels at an astonishing rate. The Naja, the Rhonda, the Emerald, the Elton, the Redcar, the Karen, the Budry, the Reginald, the Lapwing. Each name represented a ship with its own history, its own stories, now destined to become part of Scapa Flow's defenses. Brock established a headquarters in Kirkwall, coordinating the arrival of blockships, assigning them to specific channels, and managing the growing workforce. But the operation faced mounting challenges. Winter was coming, and in Orkney, that meant gales that could reach hurricane force, waves that could smash a ship to pieces, and darkness that lasted 18 hours a day. The channels themselves presented unique difficulties. Kirk Sound on the eastern side was shallow and rock-strewn, requiring smaller vessels. Burra Sound to the south had currents so strong that ships had to be towed into position. Water Sound in the northeast was exposed to the full force of North Sea storms. Mackenzie and his fellow captains developed techniques through trial and error, each sinking teaching them something new. They learned to flood ships unevenly, creating a list that would cause them to settle in a specific orientation. They discovered that removing internal bulkheads before sinking allowed water to flow more predictably, preventing capsizing. They found that sinking ships at high tide gave them more control over final positioning, even though it meant working in deeper water. The work was dangerous beyond measure. Men worked on deck as ships settled beneath them, timing their evacuation to the last possible moment. Engineers stayed below, opening valves and smashing pipes, then racing up ladders as water surged around them. Several times, crew members were nearly trapped as ships went down faster than expected. On November 23rd, during the sinking of the collier Karen in Burra Sound, a massive wave struck just as the ship was settling, washing 3 men overboard. 2 were pulled from the water by patrol boats. The third, a 44-year-old engineer named William Ross from Dundee, disappeared beneath the waves. His body was never recovered. He was the first casualty of the blockship operation, but his sacrifice barely registered in the newspapers. There were no medals, no public ceremonies. The entire operation was conducted in near-total secrecy, with the Admiralty desperate to avoid alerting the Germans to the defensive measures being implemented. As November turned to December, the pace intensified. Intelligence reports indicated that German submarine activity was increasing around the Orkney Islands. U-boats were probing the approaches to Scapa Flow, searching for weaknesses. The Grand Fleet remained at anchor, but Jellicoe was increasingly nervous. Every day without adequate defenses was a day closer to disaster. Brock pushed his civilian crews to the limit, sinking ships in weather that no sane mariner would venture out in. On December 8th, during a howling gale, Mackenzie supervised the sinking of 3 vessels in a single day: the Emerald, the Elton, and the Redcar, creating a triple barrier in Hoxa Sound. The operation nearly ended in catastrophe when Redcar, caught by a rogue current, began drifting toward Emerald before she could be sunk. Mackenzie, commanding from a patrol boat, made a split-second decision. He ordered Redcar's sea cocks opened immediately, even though she wasn't in optimal position. The ship went down in 12 minutes, settling at an angle that partially blocked the channel but prevented a collision that could have ruined the entire barrier. By mid-December, over 30 blockships had been sunk, and the character of Scapa Flow's defenses was beginning to take shape. The major channels were now studded with underwater obstacles, their positions marked by buoys for British vessels but invisible to German submarines. But Brock wasn't satisfied. The barriers needed to be denser, more complex. A determined U-boat commander might still find a way through. The solution came from an unexpected source, the local Orkney population. The islanders, initially skeptical of the massive military presence disrupting their quiet lives, had gradually become invested in the operation. They provided local knowledge about tides, currents, and underwater topography that wasn't on any chart. And they offered a resource Brock hadn't considered: wrecks. Orkney's waters were a graveyard of ships, centuries of maritime disasters scattered across the seabed. Local fishermen knew the location of dozens of wrecks, some dating back to the Napoleonic Wars. These existing obstacles could be incorporated into the defensive plan, creating additional barriers with no effort required. A fisherman named Donald Sinclair, whose family had worked these waters for 5 generations, approached Brock with a hand-drawn map showing wreck locations in Kirk Sound. Sinclair, a weathered man in his 60s with hands like leather and eyes that could read the sea like a book, explained that several wrecks lay in positions that could complement the blockships. Brock immediately saw the potential. He hired Sinclair and a dozen other local fishermen as guides, paying them to lead blockship crews to optimal positions. These Orkney men became invaluable members of the operation, their intimate knowledge of local waters making the difference between success and failure on multiple occasions. On December 19th, Sinclair guided the blockship Naja through a treacherous passage in Kirk Sound during a snowstorm, positioning her perfectly between 2 existing wrecks to create an impassable barrier. Without his guidance, the operation would have been impossible. As Christmas 1914 approached, the work continued without pause. There was no holiday for the blockship brigade. Mackenzie and his crews worked through Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, sinking the Rhondda and the Budry in Water Sound while the rest of Britain celebrated. The men were exhausted, cold, and homesick, but they understood the stakes. Every ship they sank was another obstacle for German submarines, another layer of protection for the Grand Fleet. By the end of December, 47 blockships had been positioned. The major channels were becoming increasingly difficult to navigate, even for British pilots who knew the routes. For German submarine commanders operating in unfamiliar waters, they would be nearly impossible. But the operation was far from complete. Several channels remained vulnerable, and Brock was determined to close every gap. January 1915 brought the worst weather yet. Storms swept across Orkney with relentless fury, waves reaching 40 feet, winds exceeding 70 miles per hour. The blockship operation ground to a halt for days at a time as conditions made it suicidal to venture out. Mackenzie and his crews waited in Kirkwall, watching the weather, growing increasingly frustrated. They were so close to completing the defenses, but nature refused to cooperate. Then, on January 18th, a brief weather window opened. The wind dropped to manageable levels, and the forecast predicted 12 hours of relative calm before the next storm system arrived. Brock made the decision. They would sink 5 ships in that window, completing the defenses of Burra Sound and Kirk Sound. It was an ambitious plan, perhaps too ambitious, but time was running out. Intelligence reports indicated that Germany was planning a major submarine offensive in the North Sea, and Scapa Flow remained a prime target. Mackenzie took command of the operation personally, coordinating the movements of 5 block ships and their support vessels. The logistics were staggering. Each ship needed a skeleton crew to sail her to position, a patrol boat for evacuation, and precise timing to ensure they didn't interfere with each other. At 6:00 a.m., the first ship, the Lapwing, entered Burra Sound. By 8:30 a.m., she was on the bottom. The second ship, the Reginald, followed at 9:00 a.m. The operation was proceeding like clockwork. But at 11:00 a.m., as the third ship was being positioned, the weather turned. The wind, which had been a moderate 15 knots, suddenly increased to 40 knots. Waves that had been manageable became threatening. The fourth and fifth ships were still waiting to be sunk, and the weather window was closing fast. Mackenzie faced a critical decision. Abort the operation and try again when conditions improved, or push forward and risk disaster. He chose to continue. The stakes were too high to delay. The fourth ship, a small coastal steamer named the Thistle, was already in position in Kirk Sound when the storm hit with full force. Mackenzie, commanding from a patrol boat that was being tossed like a cork, watched as Thistle's crew opened the sea cocks. But the rising waves were pushing the ship off position, driving her toward the rocks on the northern shore. If she struck the rocks before sinking, she would be useless as a block ship, and the channel would remain open. Mackenzie made a desperate decision. He ordered his patrol boat to come alongside Thistle, and in a maneuver that his crew would later describe as either brilliant or insane, he used the patrol boat to push against Thistle's hull, holding her in position as she flooded. For 10 agonizing minutes, the patrol boat's engine screamed at full power, fighting the waves, while Thistle settled lower and lower. Finally, with water washing over her deck, Thistle went down, settling exactly where she needed to be. Mackenzie's patrol boat pulled away just as the steamer's superstructure disappeared beneath the waves. The crew evacuated from Thistle were soaked, shivering and shaken, but alive, and Kirk Sound was now effectively blocked. By the end of January 1915, 70 blockships had been sunk in Scapa Flow's approaches. The transformation was remarkable. Channels that had once been wide and deep were now treacherous mazes of underwater obstacles. Submarines attempting to enter would have to navigate narrow passages, surface to verify their position, and expose themselves to patrol boats and shore batteries. The risk of running aground or becoming entangled in the wrecks was enormous. Scapa Flow, once vulnerable, had become a fortress. The proof came on February 23, 1915. German submarine U-12 attempted to penetrate Hoxa Sound, the same route U-18 had used in October. The submarine's commander, confident in his charts and his skill, entered the channel at periscope depth. He never saw the blockships. U-12 struck the wreck of Thames at 12 knots, tearing open her forward ballast tanks. Unable to dive or maneuver, the submarine surfaced directly in front of a British patrol boat. The crew surrendered without firing a shot. U-12 was towed into Scapa Flow as a prize, the first German submarine captured intact. Her captain, interrogated by British intelligence, expressed shock at the density of obstacles in the channel. He had expected defenses, but nothing like what he encountered. The blockships had worked. Over the following months, additional attempts by German submarines to penetrate Scapa Flow ended in failure. U-boats probed the approaches, searching for gaps but found none. The combination of blockships, patrol boats, and increasingly sophisticated detection equipment made Scapa Flow impregnable. The Grand Fleet remained at anchor, safe from submarine attack, able to sortie at will to intercept German surface vessels. The strategic impact was profound. With the Grand Fleet secure, Britain maintained control of the North Sea throughout the war. German surface ships were bottled up in their ports, unable to challenge British dominance. The blockade of Germany, which would prove decisive in the war's outcome, was only possible because the Grand Fleet could operate from a secure base. And that security rested on 70 obsolete merchant vessels, deliberately sunk by civilian crews in one of the most audacious defensive operations in naval history. Captain James Mackenzie and his blockship brigade received little public recognition during the war. Their work remained classified, and the men themselves were sworn to secrecy. Mackenzie returned to Aberdeen in March 1915, his mission complete, and resumed his career in the merchant service. He never spoke publicly about his role in defending Scapa Flow, and when he died in 1932, his obituary made no mention of his wartime service. The blockships themselves remained in place long after the war ended, their hulls slowly deteriorating but still visible at low tide. Some remain there to this day, rusting monuments to an operation that saved the Grand Fleet and, quite possibly, changed the course of the war. The lesson of Scapa Flow was clear. In modern warfare, defensive ingenuity could neutralize technological threats. The German U-boat, one of the most feared weapons of World War I, had been defeated not by superior technology but by strategic thinking, civilian expertise, and 70 old ships deliberately sent to the bottom. It was a victory won not with guns or torpedoes, but with courage, seamanship, and the willingness to see possibilities where others saw only problems.